I have two agendas here. For those of you who are professionals, I think you'll want the detail because you want to know what does the current research say about this topic. So I'm going to give you some detail anyway. For those of you who are parents, you may not think you want the detail, but if somebody gives you advice that's contrary to what the research says, it might actually be helpful to be able to say, well, I know of a study by so-and-so that said such and such, and then you can act authoritarian and get in people's faces like Mrs. Kahn did. So there's two sets of studies. Most of the work has been done on early language development in kids with autism, but there's also some work on early school age kids as well that I'll get to. I just want to show you, by the way, that on some of the slides you'll see this Pathways logo. The Pathways in Autism Spectrum Disorder Research Project is a longitudinal study across 5 provinces, including BC, that's been funded now since 2004. I'm part of that project, and Mayada Elsabah, who you heard speak yesterday, is also part of that project. And we've been following, give or take, 400 kids and their families from the time they were diagnosed, and at this point we're funded to continue to follow them through high school graduation. So it's a very longitudinal study with multiple funders, and a number of the studies that I'm about to show you actually come out of the Pathways project. So this is my shout out to those of you, if any of you are Pathways families, then thank you for contributing to this. We are incredibly indebted to these families who have hung with us for all the years. So you'll see the Pathways logo on some of the slides. The very first study I want to share with you, which is a case study, is this one. This is actually the only published report of the effect of early intervention that was delivered in 2 languages. And this documented the language development of a 3-year-old bilingual Korean-English boy over a 24-month period. And here's how they did the therapy. For the first 6 months, he was provided with speech-language therapy and other early intervention by a Korean-speaking speech-language pathologist, only Korean, right? Over 12 months, over the next 6 months, English was gradually introduced into the therapy, and by 18 months it was provided mainly in English, and after 24 months of intervention they did the same language tests that they had done prior to the start of intervention, and those language measures showed that he had made significant, very significant, measurable gains in English in both receptive and expressive language skills. Now, he also had some Korean, especially an understanding of Korean, but this was a study that suggests that delivering intervention in both languages may not result in equal fluency in both languages, but at least is going to result potentially in significant gains in the majority language, which in this case was English. So this was a case study. It didn't have a lot of data behind it. I think I throw it in because it was the first, and that's the first thing I want to say. Notice the date here, right? The very first published study on this issue was only 10 years ago, right? Everything since then has been since 2012. So we have 4 years of research here. 4 years of published research. Not a lot, not a long time. So it's not like we're way far behind, like we've known this stuff forever, because some stuff we have known forever and we're still not doing it. This we haven't known forever. So this is a Canadian study by Catherine Hambley and Eric Fambone, who at that point was at McGill University in Quebec. And this was the first one. They examined the early language milestones of 75 kids with autism in Quebec and Ontario. Most of the kids were speaking, only 2 were non-speaking, and they compared monolingual children who lived in homes where they're exposed to only English or only French to bilingual and trilingual children who were exposed to both English and French or to one of those plus another language, and the other language there was a long list of. Some of the kids were bilingual from birth. Some of the kids were what we call sequential bilinguals. That is, that they were the second language exposure was added after 12 months of age. They were interested in, was there a difference in early language development between the monolingual and the bilingual kids in general? And then, if there was there a difference between those who were exposed from birth versus exposed from 12 months of age? Does that make sense? The parents completed a bunch of different measures. I'm not going to go into the details of that. And punchline, the bi or trilingually exposed kids did not experience additional delays in language development compared to the monolingual children in any area, expressive or receptive or vocabulary. And the timing of the exposure didn't affect the outcomes of the children's dominant language abilities. Okay, so no negative effect of bilingual exposure in this study. Right? By the way, a number of these studies, actually the majority of these studies are Canadian, bit of a point of pride for all of you, including this one, which was published in the same year and came from UBC. So this is Jill Peterson's master's thesis. She examined language development of 14 Canadian bilingual Chinese English children and 14 English-only children, all within the lower mainland of BC, by the way. These were all speaking kids by parent report. And she gave them, again, a bunch of different measures. One of the things that's unique about this study is she measured their vocabulary in both English and Chinese with research reliable instruments. So she measured what's called conceptual vocabulary. Conceptual vocabulary means if I know the word for, I don't know, bird, I happen to know that in French. Say French is my second language. I know bird, I know oiseau. Okay? But when you count my vocabulary, you only count that once. You don't count it twice. You count it once. Does that make sense? Okay? So this measured conceptual vocabulary, and she found, again, no significant difference on any measure, and she used many, many different measures, between the two groups, the bilingual and the monolingual groups, on any of the measures. If anything, the bilingual kids had slightly higher scores than the monolingual kids, but not significantly different scores. Now, what does that mean, significantly different? It means the scores, even though they were slightly higher, could have occurred by chance, right? It could have occurred by chance. So maybe if there was a larger number of kids, because remember it was really only 14 in one group and 14 in the other group, maybe the scores would have been more, there would have been more difference or less difference, but at this point all we can say is there was no big difference. So again, the punchline is bilingual exposure in these English-Chinese families didn't have a negative effect on language development of the kids. The next study was also from UBC. This is a pathway study. This is Kaori Ohashi's master's thesis. And she compared 20 bilingual kids from across Canada, because this is the pathway study, with 40 monolingual kids from across Canada who were matched by both chronological age and nonverbal developmental age. So these kids were very similar in a number of ways. The other two studies, that wasn't the case, but these kids were similar in some important ways. From birth to age 2, the bilingual kids were exposed to either English or French and at least one other language. And again, all of these kids were speaking kids. She gave the kids a bunch of different measures, right? Including things like when their parents reported the age of first words and the age of first phrases, a bunch of other measures as well. And again, the punchline is no significant difference between the two groups on any measure. You can see that sometimes the bilingual kids are a titch higher, but that titch, ignore it, right? Because it could have happened by chance, right? So there doesn't seem in this study to be any positive effect of bilingualism, but no negative effect either, right? Just like in the others, right? Are you seeing the pattern here? We following the bouncing ball? Okay. Here's another one, not Canadian. In this study, they compared 40 monolingual English kids and bilingual English-Spanish kids. And notice that these are all, I'm not pointing out the ages, but you can read, so I assume that you're picking up that these are all young kids, right? Most of these kids spoke, but this is a unique study of the group that I'm going to show you now, because there were some minimally verbal, non-speaking, if you will, kids in the group. They measured cognitive ability, autism severity, and a bunch of different language and communication skills, and no significant difference between the two groups on any measure, except significantly, the bilingual kids tended to, especially the non-speaking kids, vocalized and used gestures more often, statistically more often, than the monolingual non-speaking kids, right? And of course, we know that vocalization and gesture use are early communication behaviors that often precede the development of speech. So these kids weren't speaking yet, but they had kind of more of the foundation skills than the monolingual kids. So here you start to see a little bit of a bilingual advantage, perhaps, in this particular study. Now we're going to go to 2014, back to Catherine Hamley and Eric Fombone, another Canadian study. They wanted to understand about a different question. So they examined the relationship between second language vocabulary size and the amount of bilingual exposure in 33 kids living in Quebec and Ontario. Again, all of these were speaking kids. And they measured a bunch of stuff, and the parents completed a bunch of measures, including a language environment interview that was completed by phone, and a language diary where they wrote down pretty much everything they said to the kid in a week. I can't imagine how they did that, but never mind. And what's interesting in this study is that based on the information, they were able to calculate the percentage of exposure of the two languages for the kids in the study. So for example, they knew that kid A was exposed to 75% English, 25% Mandarin. Or kid B was exposed to 50% Punjabi, 50% French, or whatever. Right? A little bit more detail about what bilingual meant for these kids than in the previous study. And they grouped the kids in their analysis by the size of their second language vocabulary. So their second language vocabulary, not their English or French vocabulary, their second language vocabulary. So some kids had no words in the second language, even though they had been exposed. Some kids had a few words in the second language, and then high was, a huge range of 70 to 559. I'm not quite sure why they made that all high, but they did, never mind, in the second language. So here they're looking at what does it take for the second language, the kid to learn the second language, not the English or the French, but the home language, the non-majority language. Does that make sense? And here's what they found. I'm going to read this to you because they said it better than I can. All three cognitive groups, including those with moderate to severe cognitive impairments, the kids we often call, I hate this, low functioning. I'm never going to say that again to you, but that's what we call them, had children who were acquiring second language vocabularies. And what they found is that higher levels of exposure to the second language contributed significantly to larger second language vocabularies. Duh. Okay? Here's how they said it. Children in the no and low second language groups had little to no direct caregiver communication in their second language at the time of the study, although historically they had been spoken to in both languages. Many were from bilingual homes, but were experiencing language loss or were treated as monolinguals within their bilingual family. In other words, their families had stopped speaking the home language to them, if in childcare they were either currently enrolled in monolingual childcare sites or addressed by adult caregivers in only their dominant language. So the punchline from this study is, if we want a child to speak the home language, right, we have to speak the language to the child, and the more you speak the home language to the child, the more, and not just speak around the child, but speak to the child. So from this study, it's about passive exposure versus active exposure. So if the kid's just hearing mom and dad speak Chinese to each other, but no one's speaking Chinese to the kid, it's unlikely that he's going to learn Chinese. Less so. More, however, if people are speaking both Chinese and English to the kid, there's a better chance that he's going to learn both Chinese and English. So passive exposure isn't sufficient. It has to be active exposure. And the real punchline for me from this study is that there's no reason to assume that kids with significant cognitive impairments don't also fall into this group of kids who are able to learn both the majority language and the home language. Right? So that's kind of interesting, I mean, in a whole nother kind of way, okay? This study in 2015 is the only one that's been done outside of North America so far, and this one was done in China and looked at a whole different type of language area than the other ones looked at. The other ones looked at how many words can the kid say, what's his receptive language score, what's his expressive language score. This one looked at pragmatics, the ability to use language in social contexts, which of course is particularly difficult for kids with ASD. And in typically developing kids, there's actually data suggesting that there's a bilingual advantage in the area of pragmatics, that bilingual kids do better in this area. So these authors were asking, well, is that also true for kids with autism, right? Or at a minimum, you know, how do they stack up against monolingual kids? And again, this one was done in China. So there were two groups of kids, 31 monolingual exposed who spoke one of these dialects, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce because I'll say it wrong, and 23 who were exposed to Mandarin or Cantonese, plus at least 30 to 40% from one of the other Chinese language families. Again, all of the kids were able to speak. The parents completed a bunch of assessments, and punchline, no difference between the two groups. With regard to structural language competence, that's receptive and expressive language measures, and pragmatic language and social communication skills. So they didn't find a bilingual advantage, which is found in typically developing kids for being raised in bilingual homes, for pragmatic skills, but they didn't find a disadvantage either. There's no downside again here, right? There's not the upside you kind of wish would be there based on the typically developing literature, but there doesn't seem to be any downside. Now, you know how I've been saying over and over again, but all of these kids could talk, but all of these kids could talk, but all of these kids could talk? So this is Monica House's master's thesis, just completed last week. It's a pathways study from UBC, and this is the first study to look at this issue in what we're now referring to in the literature as minimally verbal kids. And minimally verbal here were kids who spoke fewer than 5 words at the time of diagnosis. So Monica's question was, does being raised in a bilingual home affect one way or the other the language development of kids who don't talk yet? Right? So there were 24 monolingual exposed kids and 10 bilingual exposed kids. They came from 4 different provinces. Most of the bilingual kids had at least 20% home exposure to one or more second languages from birth or from age 1 to age 6, and the other 30% had exposure from age 2 to age 6. So some of these were sequential bilinguals, not from birth, right? There weren't enough for her to be able to split that. But all of them were absolutely minimally verbal, 5 words or fewer at the time of diagnosis. And Monica classified them then, for the purpose of the analysis, into two groups at age 6, because we knew where they were at time of diagnosis, which was between age 2 and age 4, and then we knew where they were at age 6. So some of them were still minimally verbal, and some of them had more than 5 single words. So they had at least a few single words, if not quite a few more. And she then entered scores for nonverbal IQ, responding to joint attention, initiating joint attention, imitation skills, and their language status into a computer, pushed a button, said to the computer, do your thing, tell me what the story is. And here's what the story was. Home language exposure, that is monolingual versus bilingual, did not predict in any way whether kids who were minimally verbal at diagnosis would be speaking at age 6. So whether or not they heard more than one language had nothing to do with whether they were talking at age 6. What, in fact, in this sample, the odds of being minimally verbal at age 6 was 5 times greater for monolingual than for bilingual kids in this sample. This is a very small sample, though, so we can't say that in general. We can say it for this sample, okay? The only measure that did predict whether kids who were not speaking at diagnosis would be speaking at age 6 was nonverbal IQ at the time of diagnosis. So kids who were more able on an IQ measure at diagnosis were more likely to be talking than kids who were less able, okay? That is not specific to the issue of monolingual or bilingual. That is finding in the language literature in general, right? Nonverbal IQ is the big predictor of whether kids who don't talk are going to eventually talk, right? Now, that doesn't mean that if you've got a really low nonverbal IQ at diagnosis, you know, the gig's up, you're never going to talk. It just means that it's going to be harder, and it's somewhat less likely that that's going to happen, but it doesn't mean that it's never going to happen. Right, do you understand? There is a relationship there, though. So these are the early language studies, right? Most of them are Canadian. A lot of them are from the Pathways database, and the results are very, very consistent, right? Early language development does not appear to be negatively impacted by bilingual home exposure, both for kids who are already speaking at the time of early diagnosis and those who are not. Although there's only one study on those who are not, so let's be tentative about that. And just like typically developing kids from the Hambly and Fumbone second study, kids with autism are more likely to learn a second language if their parents consistently speak to them in the second language. Right? So for early language development, there's absolutely no contradiction here across any of these studies that have now been done in 3 different countries by 4 different teams of researchers, right? There's no downside to bilingual exposure for early language development.